Fredrik and I'm the filmmaker.
And I'm Leilani, and I'm the advocate.
Yes, you are. I can see it. It's you. It's you.
It's me. It's really me.
It's you. Yeah, it's cool. And this is the Pushback Talks summer series. And not everybody have a summer series, but we have. And I know this joke is now getting run down, but it's still a joke, so it can work.
We go the mile.
We are proud. We're really proud. Leilani, in the film, you have a quote. You say something that provokes a lot of people around the world. I don't have a problem with capitalism. And then you say, but...
Something like, capitalism run amok, I do have a problem with.
Yeah.
Is that what I say?
Kind of that. And
Something like that.
Yeah. And today we're going to revisit a friend and a very interesting writer, Peter S. Goodman at the New York Times. He's their global economic correspondent, but he's also been working for a lot of other publications, Washington Post. He was in China for many years, he's been in London, he's been around. He has a very global perspective. But we met him to talk about capitalism, but also about his new book. And his new book is called Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World. Leilani,
An
what is the
amazing
book about?
book. An amazing book. It's about 5 guys. It's about Jeff and Larry and Stephen and Mark and Jamie, who are billionaires, not just ordinary guys. Well, they might be quite ordinary, actually, except for the fact that they're billionaires. And they run things like big tech and are involved in big pharma. They're involved in real estate and assets.
Yeah.
And he really exposes the way in which they rule the world, actually, and are affecting the little people who are just trying to make a go of things. It's a fantastic book. I can't say how many times I've recommended. I'm, being interviewed by a journalist. I'm talking to a student. I'm talking to an academic, another advocate, and I'm like, you got to read Davos, man. It's amazing. Expose.
I'm actually just back from New York, where I met with Peter S. Goodman, and
Right.
I interviewed him for my new film, and because I think he has knowledge that could travel even more.
I agree.
There's one story in the film about an employee of Jeff Bezos, the Amazon guy.
In your new film, you mean?
Yeah, the one I'm working on.
Yeah.
So I met and I filmed with Chris Smalls, who is this guy in the book. I met him first in the book, where Peter tells a story about how Chris, during the pandemic, was trying to tell the superiors that, we can't come to work, everybody, because this virus will kill us. We need protection. And the company said, no, we don't have protection. You all have to be here. And if you don't come, you'll lose your job. So people came sick. And then they were actually packing protection, sending out to people who could pay for it, but the workers didn't get.
Crazy.
And when he then started to organize more, he got fired for this. But Chris Smalls is a very cool guy, so he organized the first union in an Amazon warehouse that's in Staten Island in New York City. Very interesting guy, and it's really, since then, he's been in the Congress speaking, he's been in the Oval Room in the White House with Biden, and he's now touring the US in something that he called Hot Labor Summer. So follow Chris Smalls on Twitter, Instagram. It's very interesting to see how somebody who's coming from totally below, working this really hard, and he's now getting a big following in the US. And it's not only the Amazon workers who are now organizing unions, also the Starbucks workers are organizing unions. So there is a pushback,
Yes.
there is and this is like, it fits what we talk about very much. But we should maybe listen to Peter because we talked about a lot of things, and it's really interesting. And we started to talk about capitalism and the complications. So the billionaires are doing something to the world, Peter.
They certainly are. They are dominating our global economy, taking a system that, was never perfect. We could always find things to complain about in terms of the equity. But from 1945 till about the mid-70s was actually doing a fairly good job in most major economies of creating new opportunities for huge numbers of people. Now, I don't want a time machine back to 1975. We've made a lot of progress in all sorts of areas that we want to hang on to. But in one key regard, that period is special in that the gains of capitalism, the gains of economic growth were by and large transferred to working people commensurate with productivity. Everybody got a piece of the action. Wasn't perfectly fair. It wasn't ideal. But in that key regard, there's something that we need to get back to, because in the years since, the world's most powerful people, the people I call Davos man, this billionaire set that operates across jurisdictions, challenging their allegiance to any particular country, people who can literally hire lobbyists, lawyers, tax accountants, by the dozen in multiple jurisdictions at once, have rigged the system so that the money now flows overwhelmingly into their own coffers.
Interesting, Peter, because I did this film Push, where Leilani is the superhero, and for us, that making that film was also a journey into understanding the setup and understanding that the financial crisis 2008 kind of created this super landlord Blackstone. They really did things, and I remember we had a screening at the Castro in San Francisco, that amazing theater. Sold out, a lot of people. And a young lady came up to me after the film and said, Fredrik, I feel less lonely now, because now I know it's not my fault that it's so hard to live in this city. And actually, when I talked to Leilani now, after reading your book, she said the same. I feel less lonely now, because now I have Peter S. Goodman at New York Times telling the same story. Isn't it like that, Leilani?
That's a wonderful story. I'm sorry, go ahead, Leilani.
No, that is absolutely my experience of reading your book, Peter. I have to say, if I had to give a little, one-liner about your book, compulsive and compulsory reading. And for me, I'm Leilani Farha. I'm an advocate. I'm working here from my basement. I was the UN rapporteur on the right to housing, but that position itself, people look at a little bit strangely. So when I would talk about this stuff, especially I think actually there's a gender dimension here.
Sure.
As a youngish seeming woman weighing in on big finance and saying these guys are owning the world, they are running the world. People look at me like I'm crazy often, and your book is like all the details, all the proof, all the evidence of what's actually happening around the globe. So I have to say, it was an amazing read. It was a total page turner. I was like, every page, I'm like, what's next? What's happening next? And a huge contribution, in my opinion, a huge contribution. So
thank you so much. I think it's interesting that you say, not to put words in your mouth, but it's like it reveals this thing that's been going on that we've all sensed. I think, it's important to note, I'm not laying out a kind of puppeteer conspiracy. It's not as if, there's some dark room. There is the World Economic Forum at Davos, which plays an important role. But, even there, it's not like there's some master detailed plan. All this stuff has actually happened in plain view, but it's happened so steadily and gradually. It's a little bit like climate change, right? Like we can, if we're scientists and we're actually measuring water levels by the millimeter, then we're paying attention. If we're looking at thousandth of degrees of temperature change over time, fine. But it's not until there's a big storm where suddenly everybody's basement's flooded, where people are having to go to high ground, where people are hungry in places where there used to be plenty of food, where we say, well, hold on, what's happened here? And we've had a series of crises in recent years, between the global financial crisis, the austerity that's been imposed in much of the globe to ensure that, the richest people don't have to pay, but ordinary people who actually depend upon government services do. And now, of course, the pandemic. And so, all of this stuff that I'm tracing in this book has happened in plain view. You just have to put it together to get the picture. So I'm really glad to hear that it's resonated in that way.
A lot of these, you are pointing out, you're focusing on 5 big billionaires. They could have, I guess it could have been 5 different ones also.
Definitely.
But these are really interesting. But for us, you focus a lot about Blackstone and their CEO and founder, Steve Schwarzman. When we started to do Push, Leilani and I started to talk to each other. We didn't know anything about Blackstone. They were totally flying under the radar for a very long time. And now you put a lot of focus on them. So have they changed now? Or is this, do they like this attention?
I don't think they like this attention. I think Leilani can tell you about her own experiences in terms of, their attempts to silence her. And in my own dealings with Blackstone's communications people, I should say Schwarzman never talked to me. I spent 3 days a few years ago in Beijing at this very high-level conference where Schwarzman and I both went off with actually something like 5 heads of state, other billionaires, including Pierre Omidyar, the eBay founder. We all went off to the Great Hall of the People for an hour with Xi Jinping. This was really quite an experience. And I was able to see Schwarzman up close. He doesn't like to talk to the press. He wasn't particularly interested in talking to me. He did bring me along with a contingent of people to go visit his Schwarzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua University, which is one of the most prestigious campuses in Beijing, and a place that he's used to highlight his cooperation between the U.S. and China while he's vacuuming up investment from Chinese sovereign wealth funds, while he's pushing out his own investments in China. So, this is not somebody who likes to engage with the world other than on his own terms. And he likes to project this sense, and this I argue in the book is quintessential Davos man behavior. He likes to project his own undertakings as like a gift to the world. Like, it's not enough that he's making huge amounts of money. And, we should back up for a second. Steve Schwarzman is the world's largest private equity magnate. He's a huge real estate investor. He's worth roughly $30 billion. And, you guys ran into him, I gather, in terms of his investments in Europe and especially in Sweden, where he opportunistically entered the market after what we now call the sovereign debt crisis, and picked up huge swaths of affordable housing, jacked up the rents, evicted people, cut maintenance. And what I discovered in doing the book was, this is his template, right? I didn't discover this. Other people have written about this as well. But the foreclosure crisis in the States, he goes in and spends hundreds of millions of dollars buying up distressed real estate in the U.S., and then, flips all this real estate for a tremendous profit, which, I think for those of us who are accustomed to capitalism would say, well, that's how it works. People with money go find stuff to buy, then they sell it to somebody else for more money. But in his memoir and in his public speeches, he goes on about how, this wasn't about the money. This was this act of civic virtue. We went into places where houses had been left to the elements with, weeds overgrowing the lawns and rodents running around, and we fixed them up and fresh coats of paint. And as I say in the book, you can almost hear the soundtrack for this pleasing, life insurance commercial with some adorable golden retriever puppy romping around on a freshly cut lawn with a toddler. The reality is he starts this thing called invitation homes, which is an invitation for people to pay exorbitant rent, people who don't have the money to just easily pick up and move somewhere else, also not by accident. He's very savvy at finding people where there's engaging in transactions where essentially there's a clear power imbalance. He's got the money, he's dealing with people who are just kind of making it paycheck to paycheck. They can't just go out and go rent some other apartment and come up with a security deposit. So he jacks up their rent. to levels at which they can just manage, but he's getting the maximum. He cuts maintenance. It suddenly becomes impossible to get hold of anybody if you have a plumbing problem and an electrical problem. And this is the template that we've seen around the world, which is how you guys got on the trail, as I understand the story.
Yeah, we started off with Blackstone buying a lot of foreclosed housing in the US and in Spain and on Ireland. The Sweden story we didn't even know about, but Leilani was invited to Sweden, and we did maybe we should have a check. And then we found this story. So they've been totally flying under the radar. And since then, we've been going to country to show the film, and we always ask people, "Do you know if Blackstone is in your country?" And people most of the time say, "No, they're not here," and they are always there somewhere.
Yeah. Well, absolutely true. They're everywhere, and this whole model that they use and that the other billionaires use, the extractive industry model, using finance as to extract more wealth, is ubiquitous. It is the way it is. And in the housing world, it is the model now. So the damage that Blackstone has done isn't just within their own holdings. It's that they've established a model that is accepted. And all these other asset management firms and private equity and hedge funds and et cetera are using the same model. And so the damage is so huge. It's Blackstone is everywhere, but the model is everywhere. And this idea that they are saving the world. I mean, that's how they responded to me when I wrote what are called the Blackstone letters. When I wrote to Blackstone to say, "Hey, I think you're violating human rights here, and you can't keep doing this," they replied and just said, and you put that in your book, "What are you talking about? We are providing housing for needy families, and we have saved the world.
We're the solution. We're the good guys."
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is something that they say again and again. And, I'm not even attempting to demonize Blackstone or any other company controlled by some billionaire. I mean, it seems safe to say that if we live in the market system, and the market system has, all sorts of benefits, right? It's a very good way to find out what a fair price is. If it's a real market with a regulator ensuring that there's transparency and everybody gets a shot, then the market system is really quite vibrant. And it's a tremendous source of innovation. And we should be grateful that the market system has provided all sorts of, modern innovation. But we've got to have democracy. I mean, we can't be in a situation where the Blackstones of the world, the Steve Schwarzman of the world, can take the winnings from their business ventures and then use them to warp the rules of our democracies and essentially undermine processes that have put in place. I mean, Sweden, I think it's shocking for a North American audience to, confront the reality that this bastion of social democracy, everybody knows, 500 days of paid family leave when you have a child, and, the hospitals are open to everyone, and education's free. And I mean, I've had serious economists say to me, boy, if you're born in Sweden, you have won at life. And that's our image. And let me be careful. Like, in a lot of ways, that's actually true. And there's a lot to the Swedish model that is quite vibrant. But, Blackstone goes in and they clearly undermine the notion of affordable housing. And in so doing, they contribute to the same sort of breakdown in faith, in leadership, in authorities, in the whole notion of collectivism that's at the center of the Nordic model. The understanding that we all get something out of society. And it's a violation of the concept of society. I mean, I was really struck as I spoke to people who'd been living in these Blackstone-owned housing projects on the outskirts of Stockholm, which is seen, I think, also shocking to people who don't know Sweden, has seen, a housing bubble, the likes of which, we're talking San Francisco levels, beyond London, New York. There's less affordable housing in Stockholm than there is, in that bastion of easy rent apartments, New York City. That's a stunning thing, and that did not happen by accident. So, these people who've been living in what were once, modest middle-class homes, who suddenly, discover that, no, they're actually living in financial assets that are being traded by these entities. They're not called Blackstone, by the way. They always have some, local name to kind of shield scrutiny. And suddenly their home, where they've raised children, where they've lived their lives, is revealed to be this kind of security, a chip by which, people like Steve Schwartzman are making the next, $1 billion. And that has just a kind of debilitating, it's like an existential crisis for people to learn that this system that they've had faith in is really not built for their interests. It's built for interests who are far away and much more powerful.
Leilani, democracy, is that the answer?
Well, I'm interested to explore what it means to say that democracy, or a return to a kind of democracy, might be the answer. What are the elements in that? Of course, I'm a human rights lawyer, and so what I am wondering always, my pursuit is, how do we, or shouldn't we, use human rights and the legal obligations states have committed to and made as a way to ensure capitalism doesn't run amok, to ensure a more tame capitalism that includes social well-being and economic well-being as part of its the way it runs, the way it goes. So I was wondering, Peter, if you had ever turned your mind to that, because you do say in the book at the end, in the sort of solutions part, that part of the problem with capitalism right now is it's not, you don't use these words, and my apologies, you're far more eloquent, but part of the problem with capitalism right now is that it's not being regulated, it's not being tamed or sufficiently regulated to ensure good outcomes. Sorry, Fredrik.
Capitalism speed, we call them, or on steroids.
On steroids, that's right. Yeah. And so I wonder about the power of human rights to do what you think needs to be done.
Well, first of all, I think we need to actually take back this idea of capitalism, because I think we've absorbed in most major economies this idea that what we've got, that's capitalism. And if you're against it, then you're a Bolshevik. What we have is not capitalism. What we have in most major economies, certainly in my own, in the U.S., is a kind of welfare for billionaires, a kind of, bailout mentality where, therefore, whatever ideology works to get the next rescue crafted their way. They want free markets when they're in a position to dominate those markets. Free market is usually like a term they throw around to defend themselves against a regulator who might look askance at their monopoly power, at their tax avoidance strategies. And then the rest of us get rugged individualism. That's not capitalism. Capitalism requires a market participant who is governed by a regulator who's making sure that there's fairness and transparency. So I do think we need to reclaim that idea along. I've spent a lot of my career going back to the dot-com bubble, where I remember, I would write about the telecom deregulation in the States, and suddenly cable companies were rebuilding the old Ma Bell monopoly in the States. And if you questioned that, if you ask, well, how does the consumer benefit from, now, once again, having to deal with one company? I'd be told by lobbyists, oh, you're anti-business. Really? So being pro-business is accepting that whatever the monopolists want to do is great, and anybody who asks a critical question is I'm pro-business. I'm for small businesses. I'm for, multiple participants, and I'm for people who are at the center of our democracies applying their power to influence the nature of our markets so that more people actually benefit. That's not, that doesn't turn us into Venezuela. I mean, Davos man would have us believe that we either accept the status quo, where there's tremendous inequality, huge numbers of people left out, can't afford drugs, can't afford to send their kids to school. In the States, you're one emergency away from turning the lights off in your house and sleeping under a highway overpass. And either we accept that, Davos man tells us, or, well, we might as well be Venezuela. And, we got to give up Uber and Google and central air conditioning. We can go dumpster diving for our dinner. That's not how life works.
Oxfam the other week published a report saying that the world's billionaires, your friends, the friends in your book, they have doubled their wealth during the pandemic. So the richest people on the planet has doubled their wealth. Have they? I mean, normally we say we should reward people who do good stuff, who invent new things or so. Have they brought something new to the table for the world to make all that money?
I mean, they're the beneficiaries of the rescues launched by just about every major economy during the first wave of the pandemic, when the markets were recoiling in horror. And central bankers and treasuries put a lot of money on the line to boost asset prices, and billionaires own assets. So, not to denigrate, look, Jeff Bezos is worth $200 billion. We can argue about whether anybody should be worth $200 billion. Clearly, Jeff Bezos is a very bright guy, really hard worker, recognized a tremendous opportunity to alter our shopping experience in a way in which consumers really appreciate, right? Like, we all enjoy the convenience of click here and something shows up at our door. And during the pandemic, that probably saved a lot of people's lives and allowed those of us lucky enough to work, via Zoom, who don't have to go work in a slaughterhouse or empty a bedpan in a senior home. That allowed us a certain degree of normalcy. Thanks for that. You should be rewarded for that. But not to the extent at which the people working in your warehouses are actually having to choose between their paychecks and their health. It's not that Bezos is prospering while his warehouse workers are prospering not so much. That's the problem. It's that he's prospering because the people who work in his warehouses are prospering. And it's the same, Schwartzman's billions. He's actually said publicly the pandemic has been this wonderful opportunity to jack up people's rents. People are helpless. We know that Schwartzman's made a huge amount of money on investments in healthcare in the U.S. and especially in emergency rooms. Hey, that's a good place to be. A casino operator will tell you that you make money in a darkened room where people don't know what time it is and they're drinking a lot. Well, in an emergency room, people are not always, in the best position to ask, what's going to happen in terms of my health insurance policy and who exactly is treating me. They're going to sign the paperwork that's given to them so they can go get assistance. And people like Schwartzman have exploited that fact to jack up profits at the direct expense of the resiliency of the healthcare system for everyone else. So, you look at something like the 10 richest people in the world have doubled their wealth in the course of the pandemic. And it's clear that that is not an accident. That has happened because they had already put in place a system that ensured that every time something bad happened, someone would proffer a huge rescue, and they could use their lobbyists to influence those rescues to ensure that the asset holders, got the lion's share. And that's exactly what's happened during the course of the pandemic.
You said something good here. I mean, you mentioned the lobbyists and the image they are fighting for. I mean, Davos is a place where also gives these people the light they want to have. Leilani, you were in love with this line, the cosmic lie.
Cosmic lie.
Yeah.
Used throughout, yes. Maybe Peter can explain to our listeners what the cosmic lie is. I think this is a huge contribution that this book makes to this world, because if you don't understand the cosmic lie, then you can't address what's going on. So please explain the cosmic lie.
So the cosmic lie is this idea that Davos man has insinuated into our political discourse and our reality, that when we organize our economies around making it easier for the people who already have all the wealth to get more of it, when we cut their taxes, when we deregulate, that this will spur, innovation and growth, and that will trickle down in the form of higher wages and better opportunities for everyone else, something that in reality has happened 0 times. And, we try it again and again. And part of the problem is that in our media discourse, we're, tempted to ask, well, why do people still believe in this lie, if it's clearly a lie? Well, no one actually believes in this. I think Davos Man's skill, one of Davos Man's great attributes, is the ability to kind of make the narrative true in his own mind. And we see this again and again at places like the World Economic Forum. We see this in the halls of Congress in Washington and in legislatures around the world, including in the UK, where I was living when I wrote this book. But, Macron comes in as the president of France. And the first thing he does, not by accident, because his campaign was underwritten by people like Bernard Arnault, who, is sometimes the world's wealthiest person, depending on fluctuations in stock prices. This is the guy behind, Louis Vuitton, Dom Perignon. He owns Chateau Yquem, the famous Sauterne winery, and he loves to wander around waxing poetically about wine and playing the piano and finding new ways to not pay his taxes. And he underwrote Macron along with a bunch of other billionaires in France, understanding that Macron, who's a consummate Davos man, I call him a Davos man collaborator. He's a guy who worked at Rothschild, the giant investment bank. He's very comfortable in Davos. He speaks perfect English. He projects this sense that France is over its days of being anti-business, and to his credit, has talked about how we're going to deal with long-term unemployment, which is a serious problem in France, and has grounded the idea that a strong France, an economically strong France, will strengthen the European Union at a time when Brexit has hurt European unity. But the first thing he does is he cuts taxes on the richest people in France. And then he follows that up by increasing gas taxes, and probably not really understanding, I'm willing to believe, his own country. Because if you live in Paris, which is a city with fantastic public transportation, you can get around quite easily on a bicycle, on the metro, on the bus. The rest of the country actually looks a lot more like the United States than people might think. People will have to drive to get to work. There are a lot of people working these, crappy temporary contract jobs. Full-time work has been downgraded to temporary jobs. And as one person put it to me, we're just essentially going to work to buy gas so we can put it in the car and burn it to get to work. That's our life. And Macron comes in and he cuts the wealth taxes, he increases the gas taxes, and the result is the conflagration that we now know as, the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest movement, where pretty much every working person in France puts on a yellow construction vest and goes out and says, hey, this is going to play really well with your friends at Davos at the World Economic Forum. Oh, you're saving the world through, addressing climate change. We're not dealing with the end of the world. We're dealing with the end of the month. And Macron, of course, has to walk this back. But, this is just another example among many of the cosmic lie. And the cosmic lie is alluring because it's great for the donor class. It's a fairy tale that politicians can trot out as justification for rewarding the people who actually underwrite their campaigns. And, what they want, and we saw this, with Trump in particular, who, was fulminating against, monkey-wrenching globalization, attacking the liberal world order, pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement, saying all of these incredibly offensive, racist, misogynistic things. And yet Davos man focused like a laser on the thing that Trump could actually deliver, and that was this enormous package of tax cuts. And so people like Steve Schwarzman continued to support him, would actually apologize for him, would wander around telling people, there's not a racist bone in his body, despite all the evidence to the contrary. The cosmic lie is the central organizing principle by which Davos man convinces us the government is not necessary. Government is full of bureaucrats. We're wasting our hard-earned dollars. And if you let Davos man have more of it, we'll all benefit.
Yeah.
Just a detail, Steve Schwarzman actually got one of the finest medals in France of another president, Sarkozy. So he's like the knight of something in France. So he's a big friend of France.
Yeah. Just on the cosmic lie, it's so in the housing world in which I operate, unfortunately, this idea is so entrenched. It's lower property taxes, make money super cheap so that these guys can come in and either purchase or build and solve the housing crisis. And we know that what they actually do is they take the money and they run. They may build, but what they're building is not affordable social housing, housing for those who are most in need. But they use that cosmic lie is so entrenched in how housing is dealt with. That's one of the strengths of this book that I now am literally, Peter, I'm going to be bringing your book to all of these meetings I go to and say, excuse me, like, here is the cosmic lie and you're proliferating this lie. Sorry, Fredrik, go ahead.
No. I like where you're going. So, but I just want to bring in another cosmic liar into the game because there we have Blackstone. But then there's BlackRock. And BlackRock has been portrayed as a friendlier version of Blackstone, more environmental, responsible, and blah, blah. And I hear a lot of people talking about that. And then BlackRock has been giving a lot of responsibilities here in Europe for, Leilani, you know a lot about this.
Well, and the book details a lot of this. I have to say, when the pandemic struck, and I noticed, of course, all the central banks, regional banks lining up monetary policy and basically quantitative easing or, putting money back into the economy. I was trying to track it and follow it. And I noticed, I live in Canada, I noticed that BlackRock was being hired by all of these governments and banks to help set monetary policy. And I'm thinking, excuse me, BlackRock that has an interest in like every listed company, BlackRock with tentacles everywhere that is really working for the shareholder. We're allowing BlackRock to be the consultant to all these governments. So I say these things and people think I'm crazy and what does she know from her bunker? But maybe you can talk a little bit about the role of BlackRock with governments and what they've been up to.
Yeah, I think BlackRock is an institution that we all need to understand a lot better than we do. Bill Cohen is a former investment banker turned journalist, once referred to Larry Fink as he's like the Wizard of Oz. He's the guy behind the curtain. He's someone who has been under the radar for many years. He's the world's largest asset manager. So he manages $10 trillion in investments. A lot of this is passively invested in index funds. He's very effectively vacuumed up pension funds from around the world, university endowments, and he runs a whole series of investments. He's got exchange-traded funds, these sort of mutual fund-like instruments made up of baskets of stocks. And because he controls so much money, he's been able to track the flows of money, and he's a real kind of tech nerd. He lost a job early in his career at First Boston, where he actually helped pioneer the mortgage-backed security because of a data entry error, a kind of problem in his model, and there was a big jump in interest rates that he wasn't expecting, cost the company like $100 million. He was disgraced. So since then, he spent a lot of time on modeling and technology, and he's built up this product that's now purchased by funds that collectively control $20 trillion worth of assets. It's called Aladdin. What an ironic name. It's supposed to give these guys, it didn't predict the global financial crisis, but it's supposed to give everybody a view in real time, an alert system of, changes that should concern us in the movements of money, interest rate increases, geopolitical problems, whatever. And so people pay good money trusting that Larry Fink supposedly knows more about flows of capital than anybody else. So not by accident, after the 2008 financial crisis, he's hired on to essentially be Uncle Sam's chief financial advisor. And then he repeats the trick in the bailouts of the first part of the pandemic, where his company, BlackRock, is hired to determine which securities the Federal Reserve will buy to bolster the market. Now, I think, Leilani, you are not alone in decrying a enormous potential conflict of interest because, first of all, BlackRock controls 5% of something like 95% of all the stocks that make up the S&P 500. This is, as I say in the book, like the whole notion that we're supposed to look to Davos, man, to save us is kind of tragically hilarious because, the World Economic Forum operates under the mantra committed to improving the state of the world. And members of the forum, like Larry Fink, are, of course, the greatest beneficiaries of the status quo. They have every incentive to perpetuate the status quo. And they use this idea of stakeholder capitalism, this idea that, Milton Friedmanism, where companies are just supposed to maximize shareholder returns, and through that, the markets will do their magic. No, that's over. Now they're catering to stakeholders, labor, the environment, society in general, local communities. Fink has been front and center pushing this idea, and I argue in the book that that's really a kind of prophylactic against people wielding democracy to impose rules that would alter the status quo, redistribution of capital. So Fink comes in March of 2020. He once again gets the gig to determine what the Treasury is, what the Fed is going to buy. Investors understand that a lot of that money is going to end up in BlackRock's own exchange-traded funds. So they start putting their money in ahead, realizing that those funds are going to go up. They do. Fink gets more. Now, that itself is not such a big deal for a company that controls $10 trillion in assets, but the value of seeing behind the curtain at the Fed, that, it's hard to put a price tag on. And we've subsequently learned from the contracts released by the Fed that while BlackRock makes this big deal of fending off accusations of conflict of interest by saying, no, there's a clear barrier, there's clear separation. Our people who are working for clients, they're in a whole separate part of the operation. It turns out they can send people over to the Fed side of the curtain, then they can bring them back to BlackRock's normal profit-making channels after a 2-week cooling off period. That's just laughable.
In this podcast, we earlier had a guest called Sarah Chase, who was a correspondent in Afghanistan. She wrote a book called Thieves of State about corruption in several countries around the world. But her latest book is on corruption in America. And she talks a lot about the kleptocratic networks. And it seems like what you're describing now with BlackRock and Blackstone and all these very close relations with the politics and the institutions it seems very corrupt.
Most of what I write about in my book is flatly legal. These guys are geniuses at manipulating the democratic system so that they can do what they want. Everything that I've just told you about Larry Fink, that happened straight up in public view through the processes of review. The contracts were publicized. One of the things that's kind of amazed me, last year at Davos, Mark Benioff, who's the CEO of a big Silicon Valley software company called Salesforce, actually said, CEOs are the heroes of the pandemic. And he said, the government didn't save you. We saved you. We gave you vaccines and credit to stave off bankruptcy. And we did it not for profit, he said, but to save the world. And the astonishing thing about this, and Benioff is a Benioff's a complex character who actually does run a lot of philanthropic enterprises. He did put his own money into a San Francisco ballot initiative that jacked up taxes for companies like his own to fund services for homeless people. He took a stand against the state of Indiana when they passed a law that would have discriminated against LGBTQ people, threatened to pull investment out of the state. I mean, he's a guy who does walk the walk more than most. But, you know, in a couple of years where his company has made billions of dollars in profits, he has paid the modest sum of $0 in federal taxes. Flatly legal. You know, he's exploited these loopholes that were put in place by the Clinton Treasury that allows American companies to transfer their intellectual property somewhere else. You know, Ireland is a popular place, and then lease the use of that intellectual property back to their main business in the States and set those terms so high that on paper they're not making any money at all and paying profits accordingly. I mean, you could say, you know, Benioff would be a fool to not avail himself of that loophole. But, you know, it's worse than that. You know, he's a member of the Business Roundtable, which is this lobbying organization in Washington, once headed by Jamie Dimon, who's another character in my book, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. He's part of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I mean, these are entities that have lobbied aggressively for things like the Trump tax cuts. So, you know, this culture of corruption, it's happening in this is not like greedy CEOs with suitcases full of cash, you know, buying off corrupt leaders somewhere. This is greedy CEOs, you know, holding fundraisers that we can all see with our own eyes. This is greedy CEOs going to Davos and pontificating about how they're our saviors and we can count on the billionaires to solve all of our problems, which is, you know, just another way of selling us the cosmic lie and telling us that we don't need to regulate and we don't need to collect taxes. We can see it all.
Leilani, it seems like, I mean, when you read Peter's book, it's like this feeling of there is a little group of guys who kind of run the world, control the world, and extract values from everywhere. How do you see this, Leilani?
Yeah, absolutely. And the book is really good at giving you a sense of the world in which they operate, and they all know each other, and they're all trading assets back and forth. And, you know, this company was once owned by BlackRock, and then it's going to be invested in by Blackstone later. And, you know, it's mind-boggling, and they all live. I mean, we had on another podcast Aaron Glantz, who wrote the book Homewreckers, and you know, he talks about how half of these guys live in the same building on Park Avenue, referenced in your book as well. And
Park, no, Aaron's book was very useful to me. That's a great book, and people should read it.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, it's so I mean that club is that it's part of what makes all of what you've just said actually around how legal everything is, how they're just availing themselves of the laws actually. It's part of what makes it so difficult to bring this down, because they always have that response. Sorry, folks, but I'm well within legislation here. And I mean, there's a number of things that make it so hard to bring this down. You had mentioned, I want to go back a little bit if you don't mind, Fredrik and Peter, but you had mentioned stakeholder capitalism. And for me, it's so troubling, because one of the real central things about human rights is that it's about human beings. And in order for governments to do human rights properly, whether it's local government or national level government, they have to be meeting with everyday people and ensuring that the decisions they're making, that they have a say in the decisions that are being made about their lives. And stakeholder capitalism is a way for these guys to say that they're kind of doing what human rights says that you should do, right? They're saying, oh, yeah, we're talking to unions, we're talking to tenants and tenants associations and et cetera. And it's, of course, that's all window dressing. It's not done properly. It's actually not done. And so anyway, only to say there's all these threads that make it so difficult to bring this stuff down. Fredrik.
No, I just wanted to add, we've been talking a lot about Blackstone buying into an oat milk company here in my town, Oatly.
Right.
And and that's a company that sells themselves as being extremely planet friendly. And they claim that they by letting Blackstone in, they actually change Blackstone, which I don't really believe. But what I'm thinking of both BlackRock and Blackstone is that they're so big, so they're actually sitting in boards of thousands of companies. So actually, if they would like to save the planet, or if they would push for worker safety, they could do it because they're actually sitting on a lot of power in a lot of companies. But they don't do that. That's
Well, Fink certainly claims to have that power. Fink sort of talks both ways, right? If you pin him down, he'll say, well, actually, 75% of my funds are passive, meaning they're just in giant index funds where, you want to buy the S&P 500, then you have to buy shares of 500 different companies, whoever they are and whatever they're doing. Though at the same time, every year, and he recently put out, his most recent version of this letter to CEOs, where he has said, if you don't get right with climate change, the market will punish you and withhold capital. He has threatened to use votes to ensure that management's put in place that's friendly to his ideas about climate change. He gets a lot of ink, and now he's actually getting a lot of pushback from the right. So people are throwing around this term woke capitalism to accuse people like Larry Fink of, taking his eye off the ball of shareholder maximization, which I'm convinced is totally validating to Larry Fink. Like Larry Fink and the other proponents of stakeholder capitalism love that they're being attacked by the right for being woke capitalists, because it validates that they're actually doing the things that they're not actually doing. Because in fact, Larry Fink has funneled $15 billion in capital to Saudi Aramco to help to build a natural gas pipeline. He's one of the largest, his company, BlackRock, controls huge shares in JBS, this Brazilian meat packer that's clear-cutting the Amazon. I have this whole story in my book about how, Larry Fink, in the midst of the pandemic, is squeezing Argentina in the midst of crisis where poverty's on the rise, the government doesn't have money for basic services, and Larry Fink is heading the largest, most powerful group of bondholders, demanding an extra, several pennies on a dollar in debt repayment on the bonds, knowing that there are going to be debt workouts with developing countries around the globe. I mean, in places like Zambia, Ghana, Pakistan, they're actually cutting healthcare services in the middle of the pandemic because they have to prioritize paying back the bonds to Davos man. And at the head of that movement is Larry Fink.
So what is happening now? Are the governments doing it better now? Not letting even more power over to the already richest people on the planet?
Some good has come of the pandemic in that, in Europe in particular, there's been a step back from these crippling policies of austerity that have been really just brutal for ordinary people in many countries. The European Union has, softened its budget rules, and it's allowed countries in crisis to exceed the usual debt targets, though, none of that's permanent. And eventually we'll probably be back to a place where austerity rules. In the States, Biden comes in and has all sorts of important proposals on taxation. At some point, flirts with a wealth tax, though he's actually generally not favored a wealth tax. I argue in the book a wealth tax is absolutely, vital because, take Jeff Bezos, who, if we're just taxing income, which is what we do, is going to end up paying a lot less a share of his income than the people who are scrubbing his toilet, right? I mean, he's a guy who makes $83,000 a year on paper. That's his salary at Amazon. That's about what a public school teacher in California makes. Well, the reality, of course, is he's worth $200 billion because he's paid in stock. And we don't tax stock unless it's sold. And even then, we pay it at much lower rates than most people pay income taxes because that's called a capital gains. So Biden comes in. He wants to fund a much more expansive social safety net, which is something that we really need in the United States. And he wants to pay for it by increasing corporate taxes, back to a sort of middle level between where Trump lowered them and where they've historically been. And he wants to tax wealthy people. These go absolutely nowhere. We have gotten nothing in the United States. And it's a similar picture. I mean, in the UK, there's a conversation about increasing corporate taxes that seems healthy. But by and large, the pandemic has enhanced the inequalities that have been there all along.
And yeah, because these companies don't even pay taxes. We have this amazing American-Italian economist, Mariana Mazzucato. She is pointing out exactly what you say here, that a lot of the inventions that are used in medicine or technology are actually state-funded or publicly funded. But then they send very little back to society in taxes, because they don't see themselves as a part of any country. They see them as a global tribe that is flying over everything with a lot of different passports in their pockets.
And they tell you a variant of the cosmic lie, right? Which is, if you regulate them, if you force them to pay taxes, if you threaten their monopoly on their intellectual property, then we'll all die. Like, Davos man gets paid or we all die. We won't have any innovation. I mean, we heard all these arguments surrounding AIDS drugs, in the 90s. And boy, these companies have made plenty of money even after they were forced to share their intellectual property. I mean, none of the pharma executives are sleeping under overpasses.
I think in your book, the stuff about Pfizer and Pfizer, overcharging governments. I mean, overcharging is just not even the right word. I mean, just extracting so much wealth from these vaccines. And the scene you portray, which was news to me, about them pressuring the U.S. government to roll out boosters when the science wasn't there yet that boosters would be useful. For me, it keeps coming back to their incredible political power and their power to change the world, really. I mean, pushing for boosters when the science wasn't there. Now, maybe they were right in the end,
right,
and maybe boosters have been useful. But the fact that they can change the course,
right,
of medical practice, the fact that they can go to governments and basically pillage from a social welfare state and benefit from a social welfare state, I think is so shocking. I'm wondering, and Fredrik, hope you don't mind, but I don't normally ask the questions, but one of the big news stories for me, and I think Fredrik as well, was that Blackstone is actually quite involved in the healthcare industry in the U.S. And maybe you...
I was just
you were going there.
Team
okay.
Health.
There we go.
No, it's
go
great.
for it.
It's great. No, I mean, I never heard about the company Team Health. Had you?
No, not at all.
So, Peter, what is Team Health?
Team Health is one of the two largest emergency room staffing companies in the United States. It's a company that sends doctors, nurses, other medical professionals into emergency rooms, along with another company that's owned by another private equity company. They essentially control 1/3 of all the staff inside American emergency rooms. Blackstone bought Team Health back in 2016 for about $6 billion. And they've been accused of participating in this thing called surprise billing. This is a surprise not of the happy variety. This is like you show up at your hospital thinking that you're covered by your normal medical insurance policy. Now, medical insurance to non-Americans is, bewildering and bizarre to try to explain, because no one would have ever developed a healthcare system like we have in the U.S. But you're dealing with generally a private insurance company, unless you're dealing with the government insurance for older people, Medicare, or for lower income people, Medicaid. And people show up and they sign the paperwork needed to go get care in the emergency room. And then a few weeks later, they start hearing from collection agents when they get these extraordinary bills for, 4, 5, 8 times as much as Medicare, which is the government program, would ever have charged them. And I discovered that Team Health in particular pioneered this strategy of actually paying their doctors based on the amount of revenue they derive from patients, which is a direct inducement to order up potentially unnecessary tests. I mean, essentially, Blackstone and the other investors who've piled into American healthcare in the run-up to the pandemic have turned healthcare into a business that's really not all that different from, an airline or a fast food chain. Like the patient is the customer. You want to maximize revenue. The people working in the hospitals are costs to be reduced as much as possible so you can jack up margins. And one of the ways you do that is reduce inventory.
It's scary, Leilani. That part of the book was a lot of things that I had never heard about. It's interesting that you also look into Italy, which is then a more traditional European economy, but also Italy has been, and also my own country, Sweden, has been adopting a part of this business reality in healthcare.
I mean, Sweden is a special tragedy. Italy, briefly, the province of Lombardy, which is the wealthiest part of Italy, right? This is where Milan is, high-end manufacturers. I mean, these are truly wealthy, comfortable people who have made money over centuries by making things the rest of the world wants. And Milan, of course, is the financial center. And the pandemic just overwhelms this healthcare system because it turns out in the quarter century before the pandemic, Lombardy embraces this notion that privatization will make us more efficient. And so the result is Lombardy's got all kinds of world-class facilities for heart surgery. That's a big one. Cancer, they're just world-class. And yet they don't have any basic healthcare providers. So I talked to a woman who had just taken over a practice from a retiring general practitioner, and she's dealing with COVID. She doesn't even have time to call her patients at the end of the day. There's so many cases. There's no monitoring. You have a system where formerly a truly national or provincial level healthcare system has a bunch of institutions that can talk to one another. Well, now there's all these contractors at the table. I talked to a woman named Chiara Lapora, who's a doctor with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. And this is a woman who's, spent her life in Afghanistan, Yemen, Cambodia, conflict zones. And she's shocked to discover that her own country, Lombardy, is now a conflict zone. And she and a bunch of her MSF colleagues set up a unit in a hospital in a place called Lodi, where, she discovers that she can't even set up a system where they can control who's coming in and out of the hospital because there's so many private contractors handling the bed linens, handling the delivery of the meals. And they're all saying, well, we'll be in breach of contract if we don't show up according to our schedule. So the pandemic's, spreading there. And there simply aren't enough facilities. And also Italy listened to the McKinseys of the world and shut down hospital rooms in the name of greater efficiency. Sweden is the most tragic case of all, if you ask me, because, here's a formerly world-class, it's still a world-class medical system, but they have essentially downgraded it in order to finance tax cuts to prevent the next Ingemar Kamprad, the founder of IKEA, who famously, leaves to get out from under the high taxation that's required to finance Sweden's, really generous social safety net. They reduce taxation of wealthy people that goes along with some privatization of senior services, a diminution of senior services and hospital services. So when the pandemic comes in, aided by a kind of crackpot state epidemiologist who decides that, Sweden's going to buck the trend of lockdowns and is going to let people wander around freely without wearing face masks.
We love him.
Yeah,
so we love the crackpot man. Yeah.
So, that allows the virus to spread. But what then happens is, I spoke to people who, doctors who normally treat patients in senior homes, who told me flat out that there were directives in Stockholm. If you're living in a senior center where this thing spread like wildfire and you have COVID symptoms, you will de facto, this is the word that doctors use, these are not my words, you will be euthanized. They will put you on a morphine drip. They will cut fluids and it's lights out. They're not taking you to a hospital because they understood, and I spoke to people in hospitals who told me the same thing. We just don't have enough capacity to deal with this. We don't have enough ventilators. We don't have enough beds, and we're going to have to make some decisions about who's going to live and who's going to die. So if you're in a senior home and you've got symptoms, we're not bringing you to a hospital. We're not even going to check you out in many cases. We're just going to say, that's it for you. And meanwhile, I spoke to nurses inside these privatized senior homes who have no masks, who have no instructions, who have been, their jobs have been downgraded over decades based on these tax cuts and cuts to social services.
They're not full-time staff.
They're not full-time staff. I mean, it was a horror show in Sweden.
Yeah.
Played out very similarly in Canada, sadly, in terms of the long-term care homes. And precisely because long-term care homes in Canada have been financialized. So the private long-term care homes work exactly as you described. Not enough equipment, not enough staff, temporary staff, no PPE, the protective gear for folks working there. I mean,
and meanwhile, the billionaires have doubled their wealth.
Right.
Yep.
That's the story in your book, and that's the story of this podcast. And so, Peter and Leilani, it's kind of a depressing story. So where's the light? I mean, my film, I would say the light lies in understanding things and getting a language to talk about things. So in some way, the light lies also in New York Times correspondent writing this book, because I can feel that you're kind of angry.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, actually, because I think the light lies in us waking up as a society to what's been done to our democratic institutions. And, a lot of people read my stories. I wrote a story about what happened in senior care homes in Sweden, or the privatization in Italy. Oh, that's so sad. I just feel so sad. Of course it's sad. I mean, it's a heartbreak that, I spoke to a woman who lost both of her parents in the same care home in Stockholm. She wasn't even able to say goodbye, to her mother. She could see it happening, and she was, yes, it's sad, but more than sad, it's outrageous. It's absolutely outrageous that the world's wealthiest people have used this pandemic to profiteer, to add to their wealth, while they're actually telling us that they're saving us, and even telling us, back to Mark Benioff, who I find particularly interesting, the CEO of Salesforce, who goes on television in April of 2020 and says, well, the thing about the virus is we're all one. It's unified us as one humanity, uniquely vulnerable to this coronavirus. And, he says it's erased the illusion of our borders. By the way, I heard from a Salesforce employee the other day who pointed out that Salesforce actually does a lot of business with ICE, the part of Homeland Security that defends the not illusory border. And Benioff, of course, is giving us this whole kumbaya, magic carpet ride to one humanity speech from, I can't remember if it was his $28 million home overlooking San Francisco Bay, or his oceanfront home on the big island of Hawaii, or maybe on a sailboat where he tweets pictures of himself with Lars Ulrich, the drummer for Metallica. The idea that we're all one is belied by the simplest observation about who's delivering the packages, who's emptying the bedpans, who has to go work in a slaughterhouse, who works in an Amazon slaughterhouse where they have to choose between eviction if they lose their paycheck, or putting themselves in harm's way. So I think outrage is part of our solution here. It is not going to be easy to take on the apparatus that is Davos Man to reclaim our democracies and overcome the money that Davos Man is capable of, and Davos Man has just unbelievable resources. Amazon actually released they produced themselves a bunch of television spots depicting all of the wonderful ways they were protecting their warehouse employees, with interviews with happy warehouse workers. And they sent these out to American television stations that aired them as their own segments. The apparatus is formidable, but we've been here before. we stared down the robber barons in the 1920s. After the Great Depression, we got the New Deal in the US. We got a tremendous social safety net in the UK. The Nordic model's been built up over years. I mean, we have a template where you can take on monopolists with antitrust enforcement. You can build up the power of labor. And by the way, stakeholder capitalism, yeah, they talk about labor, but they don't talk about labor unions. And you have to increase the power of labor unions. And if we can do those things, if we can bring back progressive taxation, antitrust enforcement, and it's absolutely vital that we boost labor power so labor can bargain for its piece of the action, we could solve an awful lot of problems. Again, that's a simple prescription, not at all simple in terms of execution, but that's what we got to do.
And the human rights perspective,
imperative.
Leilani.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say about the light. The book, I mean, there were moments actually, Peter, when I cried in your book. Obviously, it's the human stories for me that are the most moving. When I start thinking about people losing jobs and telling their kids they're not going to college and that kind of stuff, it's heartbreaking. But I also laughed my head off. You have a very sharp wit. And,
thank you.
And so there is light in this book because it's the absurdity, it's the outrage that you bring to light, and you do make the reader laugh, at least this reader.
Well, thank you.
In terms of, how do we bring this down, reconstruct, I liked there was a sort of pragmatism at the end where you're like, you know what? We have the tools. We have them. We have to harness them. We have to believe in them. We have to maybe reinvent them for this century and, et cetera. And I think I'm with you on that. I'm actually, as listeners will know, and Fredrik knows, I'm about to release a set of what I'm calling, in a very unsexy way at the moment, human rights directives on the financialization of housing. So a kind of, here are the actors, here are the instruments, here's how it's all unfolding, and here's what we've got to do. Very practical, but using human rights. A lot of what I'm talking about is tax reform.
Right.
Better legislation to protect, in this case, tenants. It could be workers,
right.
So, and I think that's right. I mean, I think there's a lot that can actually be done fairly easily if we can get governments to actually re-engage, to pivot. I mean, governments right now are beholden to Davos, man. They're beholden. They're in bed with them. They're facilitating. They work with them. They're chummy. They're friends, etc. And so we need governments to pivot back to people, I think, and to take seriously human well-being. I actually thought the pandemic was going to be the time. And as you say, we've failed. So far, it's a failure. It's a huge failure. It was worse than a failure, actually, in some ways.
I mean, it's a tragedy.
But it's a tragedy. It is, yeah.
But it's brought some images that we need to have, into stark relief. I mean, back to the climate change metaphor. This isn't like, hey, look at the model. Look what's happened to half centimeter, a half a degree Celsius increase. No, this is like, hey, there's floods, folks. Like we're watching people in boats, hanging on for dear life. And, maybe let's hope that will at least catalyze a serious conversation about how we got here and where we need to go.
So Peter S. Goodman and Leilani, he sends it straight off to you. Where do we need to go? We need to do something. And you have your human rights directives, which is also creating language for change. Mm-hmm. I think that's one good step. We can not only be angry, we also have to be constructive and reframe the debate in some way.
And the world is ready for this. I mean, people are pushing back, as we say, everywhere and demanding a different world. And it's amazing, actually, what's happening. In my world, as small as it is, all about housing, people are demanding a different reality. They want a decent place to live, and they don't want these big financial actors engaged anymore. So when I wrote the human rights directives, it was very much with that in mind. Like, how do we change the structures that are in place, that are deeply embedded in our economies, actually? I mean, real estate is a significant part of the GDP of many, many countries. So how do we change that so that people can just get on with the business of living.
Yeah, but it's also, we opened up to talk about the love of capitalism, but also this kind of failed capitalism, where these guys are kind of always, they don't want any competition. They want to rule their sector totally, which is kind of not very sound for a society. And it has also a severe effect on smaller companies, so these guys are kind of taking all of it, which we should do something about. And of course, then the measurement of GDP that you mentioned, that the GDP, so big part of the GDP is housing. So it's finance. So it's not real economic value in some way.
This is the amazing thing of the financialization of housing. It's not what used to be called productive part of the economy. It's mostly, this big entity of some sort, financial entity, purchasing something that someone else owns. And then they trade it, and they trade it again, and they trade it again. It's just back and forth. It's not creating anything. There's no value there.
I was actually in New York when I was meeting Peter S. Goodman. And for me, coming from Sweden, it was so expensive. Right. It's so expensive. And I'm thinking that for every cup of coffee I buy, how much are we paying for real estate? Yeah. Because we know that the producer who actually produced the coffee beans are getting the least. Yes. The guy or the girl behind the counter doing the coffee gets the least. So it's.
I love that. I never thought of it that way before. That's so bang on. That's
whatever
crazy.
You consume in those big cities it's mainly real estate you're paying for. So the money flies away. Remember we said, Saskia says in Push, if you need to go buy a cup of coffee, you shouldn't go to Starbucks because then you financialize all it just flies out.
And the money goes out of the community, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
The problem is, of course, that the pricing of housing also means that a lot of money goes out anyway because of the rents that these restaurants have to pay. And all of us have to pay. So they are in... There is an extraction of value of all the work all of us are doing all the time from these guys who have just been playing with their money and put them on top of our homes and workplaces. Yeah. And it's actually not helping the economy, it's destroying the economy. That's Peter Goodman is pointing out that really well in his book. So please read it, Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured the World. So Leilani, summer series. Do you like to do summer series?
It's very easy for me to do summer series. I got time off.
But soon we are back.
Who wouldn't like it?
We're soon back into the real world, and we have to start to produce new programs. And we have a lot of amazing things to do this coming autumn. We will keep talking about your human rights directives. I might open a little bit into show you something from my new film. I don't know when, but there might be some small snippets coming out to our dearest followers, and which are you, the listeners of this podcast. And if you like the podcast, tell your friends, tell everybody who wants to know, who wants to be smart at the dinner, or just want to understand a bit more of something, that this is actually worth listening to. And if you don't think so, don't say anything.
Well, they can tell us how we could improve.
Oh, yes, and you can write to us also.
We like feedback.
You can give us
gentle feedback. Yeah.
Gentle feedback. And you can also write reviews on the platform where you're listening.
Yes.
Which is kind of good for us because then it looks like we are really important, which we are, of course.
Yeah, except we'll be like Uber drivers. 5 stars, please. 5 stars.
Yes. So, my dear, I wish you good ending of the summer, and we see you very soon. Ciao.
Bye, Fredrik.